My scalp still tingled where my father's hand had yanked my hair, but it was the silence that haunted me most. No one screamed. No one stepped in. Not even Celeste. That was the last time I stood inside Whitmore Estate, the mansion I grew up in, the house my grandfather built, the legacy he left me. Minutes later, I was on the pavement in the rain. My suitcase burst open. My bones bruised against the stone steps. And my family? They shut the door like I had never existed. But it didn't start there. I'm Elena Whitmore. I was born into money, marble floors, and mahogany expectations. Our estate in Providence, Rhode Island, sat on a hill like a monument to power. We had generations of family portraits, oil on canvas, staring down the grand staircase. Everyone who saw our lives thought we were perfect. Dinners with silver cutlery, horses named after Greek gods, charity galas in glass buildings. They didn't see what was behind the portraits or who was allowed to matter. My older sister, Celeste, was the family's crown jewel. The day she turned 16, my parents gave her a midnight blue Porsche and threw a party that shut down half the neighborhood. When I turned 16, I got a prepaid Visa card and a brief, distracted, "Happy birthday, sweetheart," before my mother took a phone call and left the room. Celeste was beautiful in the way that made adults sigh. She'll marry well someday. She flunked 3 classes, and my parents hired a team of private tutors flown in from New York. I brought home straight A's, won state math competitions, and was told to stop bragging. They never hit me. That's what I used to tell myself. But being invisible in your own family is its own kind of violence, especially when they make you feel like you should be grateful for being ignored. The only person who really saw me, who believed in me, was my grandfather, Franklin Whitmore. He wasn't just the founder of Whitmore and Hart, one of the most respected historic restoration firms on the East Coast. He was the man who taught me how to sail against the wind. "Leadership isn't about being liked," he'd say, adjusting the sails of his prized boat. "It's about understanding where the wind is headed and knowing when to tack." Every Saturday, while Celeste went to spa appointments or sulked over boys, I climbed aboard his boat, the Marigold. We talked about architecture, history, finance, the weight of legacy. And when it rained, we'd visit art museums. He taught me to notice things: how light touched marble, how shadows gave depth, how silence could speak louder than any speech. By the time I was 18, he was already sharing company reports with me. We'd sit in his study, reviewing quarterly earnings, investment options, and ethics policies. "You see the business," he said once, his voice hoarse but proud. "Not just the numbers, but the soul of it. That's rare." And then came the summer. Everything changed. Grandfather's health began to slip. Nothing sudden, just slower steps, deeper breaths, a slight tremor in his left hand. My parents dismissed it. He was just getting old. But I knew better. I moved into the guest wing to care for him, setting reminders for medications, managing his appointments, reading him The Atlantic when his eyes grew tired. He joked that I was the only person who knew the password to his soul and his safe. And one night, after a particularly rough coughing fit, he whispered, "If something happens to me, Elena, remember this. They won't like what I've planned, but I trust you to hold the line." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand what he meant. Not yet, but I would. And when they came for everything he gave me, when they tried to tear down the very legacy he built with his bare hands, they had no idea what kind of storm I had learned to sail through. They thought I was soft, but grandfather knew better. He'd spent his whole life teaching me how to navigate, and I was just getting started. Grandfather lasted longer than the doctors predicted. 6 months turned into 8, as if sheer willpower held him together. In those final weeks, the estate grew quieter. My parents were always at fundraisers or important meetings, and Celeste popped in just long enough to take a selfie by his bedside, then left, saying the air smelled like death. But I stayed. I moved permanently into the East Wing and became his shadow, tracking medications, liaising with doctors, adjusting his pillows, reading the Wall Street Journal aloud when his voice gave out. The man who had mentored Fortune 500 CEOs now relied on me to help him sit up. And through it all, he never stopped being himself. "Do you know why I never trusted your father with the business?" he asked one night, his voice thin but sharp. "Because Charles sees profit, but he doesn't see value. There's a difference." Another time he reached for my hand, his skin papery and cold. "Don't let them make you doubt yourself, Elena. Your integrity is your inheritance." The night before he died, there was a different energy in the room, a strange clarity in his eyes. He asked me to bring him the small wooden box he kept in his study drawer, the one with the brass compass etched into the lid. Inside was a pocket watch, old and polished, and a folded note with my name. "If anything happens," he whispered, "you'll know when to look." I didn't ask questions. I just nodded, clutching the box like a lifeline. He passed away the next morning, before sunrise, with my hand still in his. The funeral was a performance. My mother arrived in black Chanel and dark sunglasses, pretending to dab her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. My father spoke to every reporter, making sure they spelled Whitmore correctly. Celeste sobbed like a fallen starlet, full of camera-ready grief. I stood silently by the casket, numb, angry, hollow, but mostly alone. After the funeral, we gathered in the estate library, wood-paneled walls, a fire that didn't warm anything, and Gregory Phillips, the family lawyer who had known our family longer than I'd been alive. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Franklin Whitmore's will was brief, precise, and impossible to misinterpret. "To my granddaughter Elena," Gregory read aloud, "I leave full controlling interest in Whitmore and Hart, the estate property known as Whitmore Hill, and all associated assets including business holdings, art collections, and family trusts. Total estimated value, approximately $12 million. The room went still. Celeste looked like someone had punched her in the throat. My father's jaw clenched so hard I could hear his teeth grind. My mother blinked once, twice, then smiled tightly, as if this was just a game she intended to win. Celeste received a trust fund, generous but modest, enough to keep her in designer heels, but nowhere near the empire she expected. My parents were left with personal items, photos, letters, a bronze sailing trophy from the 1970s. No shares, no power, no control. "This is a joke," my mother snapped, standing. "Gregory, tell them. Tell her this can't be right." "It's what your father wanted," Gregory said, looking uncomfortable. "The documents were signed, witnessed, and notarized. Everything is legal and binding." Celeste's voice cracked. "He was manipulated. She moved in with him, isolated him." I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because in that moment I realized something chilling. They weren't just shocked. They were furious. Not because they thought I wasn't worthy, but because grandfather had chosen me anyway. And nothing enrages the entitled more than losing to someone they never even saw coming. For the first few days after the will reading, the estate was eerily calm. Too calm. There were no direct confrontations. No shouting. Just silence. The kind that settles over a room right before a storm hits. I tried to keep my routine. I moved into grandfather's study to begin sorting through business records, determined to honor what he had trusted me with. But things began to shift, subtly at first. The housekeepers I had grown up with, people who had once offered me cookies in the kitchen, now avoided eye contact. The gate's security code changed without notice. My emails to the company's board members bounced back mysteriously. And when I asked my father about the files from the office safe, he smiled and said, "Just helping Gregory with probate. Nothing for you to worry about." I did worry, because grandfather had told me exactly where he kept the original company agreements, and now the safe was empty. I brought it up at dinner that night. Celeste was sipping wine like nothing had happened. My parents barely looked up from their plates. "What exactly are you looking for?" my mother asked sweetly. "Documents that legally belong to me," I said evenly. "My father sliced his steak," with surgical precision. This is exactly the kind of paranoia your grandfather should have prepared for. You're clearly not handling the pressure. You mean the pressure of watching you gut his legacy like vultures? I snapped. His eyes darkened. Watch your tone. Celeste smirked without looking up. Careful, Elena. People might start thinking you're unstable. That night I called Naomi. I told her everything. The files, the coldness, the manipulation. Her voice on the other end was sharp and urgent. They're building a case, she said. They're going to try to prove you're not mentally fit to inherit. They can't do that, I whispered, even though my gut already knew they could, or at least try. The next morning, I woke to a formal summons, Gregory Phillips requesting a meeting at his downtown office. I went. I shouldn't have gone alone, but I did. His office was pristine. Framed degrees, crystal paperweight, photos of him shaking hands with men in power. He offered me coffee. I declined. Your grandfather's will has caused quite a stir, he began. It may not be in everyone's best interest to follow it to the letter. It's not open for interpretation, I said, crossing my arms. Wills rarely are, he replied smoothly, but courts are, and juries, especially when medical experts suggest cognitive decline during someone's final weeks. My skin went cold. He leaned in slightly. What we propose is simple. You retain a role, public-facing, symbolic. The business decisions, handled by your parents. A graceful transition. Everyone wins. I stood. Not happening. Gregory's smile never wavered. I'd think carefully before forcing this into court. Allegations could be made. Stories told. Things taken. The threat was clear. They weren't just trying to claw back what grandfather gave me. They were laying the groundwork to destroy me. Personally, publicly, legally. When I returned home, my bedroom door was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it that way. My laptop was on the bed, open, though I'd shut it before leaving. Some of my documents had been moved, rearranged. My drawers weren't quite how I left them, and on my desk sat a sticky note with a single line written in Celeste's perfect cursive. Still think you're safe? I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old house felt like a whisper I couldn't hear. Every shadow along the hallway seemed like it might move. I locked my bedroom door, wedged a chair under the handle, and backed up my entire hard drive onto a USB I wore around my neck like a pendant. They weren't just plotting. They were actively dismantling me. 3 days later, I received a formal invitation to a family resolution meeting over breakfast. The wording was ridiculous. I almost laughed. Almost. The dining room looked more like a courtroom than a family table. My parents sat at the head, flanked by Gregory Phillips and a tall man in a gray suit who introduced himself as Dr. Harmon, a medical consultant. Celeste sat beside them, all pearls and predator's calm. We wanted to clarify a few things, my father began. There have been concerns about the validity of your grandfather's decisions. Gregory slid a folder across the polished oak table. Inside were fabricated medical records. Notes from a neurologist I'd never heard of, claiming grandfather had shown signs of increasing cognitive disorganization. Dated just 2 weeks before he died. Beside them, a letter, supposedly from grandfather, accusing me of manipulating him, asking for a review of any recent changes to his estate plans. It wasn't his handwriting, not even close. This is forged, I said, voice shaking. It's been verified, Gregory replied, folding his hands, by independent experts. Which you probably paid, I snapped. Elena, my mother said in that faux compassionate tone she used on PR interns. We know this is hard, but the facts speak for themselves. We've already submitted a petition to the court, and we've been granted a temporary stay on all asset transfers, my father added. Celeste tilted her head, feigning innocence. I told them we should just split it evenly, but no one listens to me. My stomach turned. You planned this from the moment the will was read, I whispered. Dr. Harmon cleared his throat. There's also the issue of your mental state, Elena. Your family has expressed concern. There it was. The trap. They weren't just taking the house, the company, the inheritance. They were trying to paint me as unstable, unfit, unwell. I stood. I'll have my lawyer respond. My father's expression hardened. That won't be necessary. The next words changed everything. You have until this afternoon to pack your things. I froze. You're kicking me out. I asked. This is our home, my mother replied, cool and decisive. And until legal ownership is resolved, we determine who stays here. You can't be serious. We're being generous, Gregory chimed in. You'll avoid escalation if you leave peacefully. Celeste smiled. I can help you pack. I left the room before I screamed. I sprinted up the stairs, shoved open my door, and pulled out the biggest suitcase I owned. I began shoving in clothes, documents, anything I could carry. My hands trembled too hard to fold anything properly. I was halfway through grabbing grandfather's journals when my mother appeared in the doorway. You're not taking that, she said, pointing at the suitcase. These are my personal things. Everything in this house belongs to the estate, she snapped. Hand it over. No, her voice rose. Ungrateful little snake. We gave you everything. You gave me nothing, I hissed. Grandfather gave me a future. You're just trying to steal it. Charles, she shouted. He arrived seconds later. I don't know if he ran, or if he'd been waiting just around the corner. Give me the bag, Elena, he said, voice low. I said no. What happened next didn't feel real. He didn't reach for the suitcase. He reached for me. His hand closed around my hair and yanked. Hard. Pain exploded through my scalp. I screamed, clawing at his wrist, but his grip was iron. You want to fight us, he growled. This is what happens to manipulative little girls who overreach. He dragged me across the hardwood floor, through the hallway, past Celeste, who stood frozen, eyes wide and smiling, then down the grand staircase, one step at a time. The fall down the stairs was blur and impact. My elbow slammed into the marble banister. My knee cracked against a step. My head thudded once, just enough to spark nausea and white-hot static. Then came the rain. My father dragged me out through the front door like I was a stranger caught trespassing. My suitcase followed, flung so hard it split open. Clothes, documents, and a small velvet pouch scattered across the wet stone like discarded trash. You are no longer welcome in this house, he said, straightening his tie like it had been an inconvenience rather than an assault. If you try to return, it will be considered trespassing. The door slammed shut behind me. Security guards stood at the gate, stony-faced. None of them looked at me. None of them said a word. I gathered what I could into the torn suitcase with shaking hands. My scalp throbbed. My left side pulsed with bruises I couldn't yet see. My jaw was clenched so tight it hurt to breathe. I didn't cry. Not then. I made it to the edge of the property, curled beneath the twisted branches of the oak tree by the road, and called Naomi. I need help, I said. They kicked me out. I have nowhere to go. She arrived 20 minutes later, barefoot in flip-flops, hair still damp from a shower, panic in her voice. Elena, what the hell did they do to you? She helped me into her car. I collapsed into the passenger seat like my bones no longer worked. Once we were safe inside her apartment, I finally let go. The tears came fast, choking, hot. I couldn't form sentences. Naomi held me like I was breaking. Because I was. The next morning, she insisted we file a police report. The officer at the precinct typed slowly, barely hiding his skepticism. So, your father dragged you out of the house by your hair because of a will? No, I said. He assaulted me, and they're trying to steal my inheritance. He filed it. But I knew nothing would come of it, not without witnesses, not against the Whitmore name. 3 days passed. My credit cards were frozen. The joint family accounts were closed. Naomi's landlord got a call. Either I leave or everyone in the building faces eviction. She begged me to stay, but I knew I couldn't drag her down with me. I spent the next 2 weeks in cheap motels, moving every few nights, applying for jobs, living off the few $100s left in my account from an old internship. Every interview vanished after the first call. One hiring manager pulled me aside, whispered, "I don't know what you did to piss off your family, but we've been warned." I'm sorry. I sold my laptop, my last real possession. On what I thought would be my final night with a roof over my head, I sat on a sagging motel bed, surrounded by damp clothes and unopened job rejection emails, searching through my half-destroyed suitcase for anything else I could pawn. That's when I saw it, the velvet pouch. Inside was grandfather's old pocket watch. Gold, heavy, impossibly quiet. He used to wind it before our sailing trips, said it was more reliable than instinct. I turned it over in my palm and froze. There was a seam along the back plate, almost invisible. My heart stuttered. He'd once taught me a strange press and slide motion for his office safe. Just a little game between us, he'd said. A backup. I pressed. The back popped open. Inside was a folded note in grandfather's handwriting and a USB drive. The paper was smooth, the ink slightly faded, but unmistakably his. Grandfather's handwriting, looped and steady, like the man himself, filled the page. My dearest Elena, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened. I feared they might try to take what is rightfully yours. They've always resented what we shared, what I saw in you. But you were never alone. This drive contains everything. My verified medical evaluations, full documentation of your readiness to lead, and recordings of conversations that prove my intentions. Most importantly, contact Richard Donovan. He's expecting you. And remember, true leaders sail against the wind. You've trained for this your whole life. Now go, make your stand. With all my love, Franklin. I stared at the note for a long time. Then I plugged the USB into Naomi's borrowed laptop and began to watch. Hours passed. There were files, dozens. Medical records showing grandfather's sound mind. Dated, signed, reviewed by independent physicians. Audio recordings of our conversations. Him testing my knowledge of company structure, discussing succession plans, ethics policies, and videos. In one, he looked directly into the camera, pale but alert. If they ever tried to contest my will, show them this. I was of sound mind. I made this choice because Elena is the future of this company. Not Celeste, not Charles. Elena. My hands trembled as I clicked through folder after folder. There were even financial documents, proof of separate accounts he'd set aside for emergencies. Nearly $1.6 million, hidden in a trust under an alias only Richard Donovan could unlock. That name pulsed in my memory. Richard was a quiet man who used to visit the estate during my childhood. He always brought bourbon for grandfather and war novels for me. I hadn't seen him in years. I found his number scrawled in the back of the letter. He picked up on the second ring. "Elena," he said calmly, "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." That night, Richard drove 3 hours to pick me up from the motel. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to. "Your grandfather anticipated this," he said as we drove north, the city lights fading into dark highway. He hoped it wouldn't happen, but he prepared just in case. Richard's home was an old farmhouse on the edge of Newport, quiet, fortified, with an office full of paper files and thick legal books. He handed me a whiskey glass that night, poured just one finger's worth. To Franklin, he said. I didn't drink it, not yet, but I held it in my hand as a promise. By morning, we had a plan. Richard contacted his old colleague, Daniel Grayson, a retired estate attorney with no connection to my family, sharp as a razor and furious by what he read. "This isn't just inheritance fraud," Daniel muttered, scanning through the files. "It's calculated asset conversion, conspiracy, possibly criminal collusion." Together, we assembled a case file, verified medical reports disproving cognitive decline, grandfather's handwritten note, audio and video evidence of intent, documentation of a forged letter's metadata, proving it was created after his death. Then came the financials. Richard opened the emergency trust. $1.6 million untouched. "Elena," he said, "you have leverage. Money. Proof. A name they didn't think you could defend." "And the will?" Daniel nodded. "We'll file for injunction. Freeze all assets. Lock the company. Make the court force them to answer." "And Celeste?" "We'll deal with her," he said. "She's part of this, whether she knows it or not." I stared out the window. The estate had once been my whole world. But now I had something more powerful, a chance to take it all back. The courthouse was nothing like the estate. No chandeliers, no oil paintings, just cold marble floors and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly worse than they really were. But I'd never felt more at home. Outside, a small group of reporters had gathered, tipped off by the injunction filing. My parents' names still carried weight in Providence, but that was about to change. I walked in with Daniel on one side, Richard on the other. I wore my grandmother's navy blazer, tailored to my frame. My hair was pinned back, partly to look professional, partly to cover the healing bruise near my temple from where my father had shoved me into the stair rail. Inside, the room felt tight. My parents were seated with their legal team, 5 high-powered attorneys flown in from Boston. Celeste sat to their right, still draped in wealth. But this time there was something brittle behind the gloss. Judge Eleanor Harrington presided, stoic, silver-haired, sharp-eyed. She was known for hating drama and punishing liars. Perfect. The defense went first. Gregory Phillips stood, voice smooth as silk, explaining how my grandfather had fallen under the emotional influence of a well-meaning but misguided granddaughter. They presented letters, expert statements, medical claims of confusion and cognitive decline. They painted a picture of me as the manipulative golden granddaughter who had exploited an old man's trust. Then it was our turn. Daniel didn't rush. He began by playing a clip, grandfather, sitting in his study just 2 weeks before his death, listing the board members he trusted, detailing business strategy, quoting figures from memory. His mind, even in that frail body, was razor sharp. Then came Martha Stevens, grandfather's longtime secretary, who testified to the signing of the will. She'd been there. She remembered every word. The household staff spoke next, 2 former employees who had overheard my parents discussing how to fix the will before grandfather had even passed. One even remembered Celeste laughing about shutting Elena down before she gets too comfortable. The courtroom shifted. Then came the final piece. The video. Grandfather, filmed just days before his death, speaking directly to the camera. If this is being played, someone is trying to take from Elena what I gave her. I was of sound mind. I made my decision not out of sentiment, but out of respect for her character, integrity, and ability. She is not just my heir. She is the only one fit to carry my legacy forward. The silence was absolute. Even Judge Harrington leaned forward. Finally, Daniel addressed the forged letter. We showed metadata, proving the document had been created after grandfather's death on Gregory's own law firm computer. And then Peterson entered the room, our longtime butler, the man who had stood silently as I was dragged across marble and thrown into the rain. "I can't stay quiet anymore," he said, voice shaking. "I saw what happened. Mr. Whitmore physically assaulted Miss Elena. No one stopped him. And I regret that I didn't either." You could feel the air shift. My mother turned pale. Celeste looked like she wanted to vanish. The judge called for a short recess. When she returned, her voice had an edge like ice. Based on the overwhelming evidence, this court finds that the will of Franklin Whitmore is valid and binding. The forged letter is inadmissible and will be referred to the district attorney's office for criminal review. She turned to my parents. The attempt to remove Miss Whitmore from her property and company is a direct violation of estate law and fiduciary duty. Effective immediately, all assets are to be returned, and temporary control will be transferred back to the rightful heir. My father sank lower in his seat. My mother stared straight ahead. Celeste finally had no words. I had walked into that room with everything to lose, and walked out carrying the weight of an empire. 3 days after the ruling, I received a call from a new number. My parents' new attorney, Gregory Phillips, had been suspended pending investigation. Sounded nervous. They'd like to meet, he said, to settle quietly. They're willing to drop all appeals and acknowledge the court's ruling publicly. I said nothing. They ask only to retain their current residence and access to a symbolic portion of this estate. I agreed to meet, not to negotiate, but to look them in the eye. We gathered in Daniel's office. Neutral ground. My parents looked older, or maybe just more hollow. Celeste sat a little apart from them. Her eyes avoided mine. My father spoke first. "Elena," he said, voice stripped of the usual arrogance, "we made a terrible mistake." I stayed quiet. "We were desperate," he continued. "The company was failing. The debts, the bad decisions, we panicked. But we didn't mean for it to go so far." "You dragged me down a flight of stairs," I said, calm and clear. "You threw me into the street like a criminal. You tried to erase the man who built everything you stand on. Don't insult both of us by calling it a mistake." My mother dabbed her eyes with a linen handkerchief. "We were wrong, horribly wrong, but we're still your parents. That must count for something." I met her eyes without blinking. "It didn't count when you replaced love with strategy, when you chose Celeste every single time. It didn't count when you watched him hurt me and said nothing." Celeste finally spoke. Her voice was small. I didn't know what to do. "You did nothing," I said. "I was scared," she whispered. "They said if I didn't help them, they'd cut me off. I had debts. I thought I'd lose everything." I leaned back in my chair. "You watched them destroy me, because you thought your version of everything was more important than what was right." Silence. Then my father asked, "What do you want, Elena?" I looked at each of them. "I want you out of the estate by the end of the month," I said. "You may take personal belongings. Nothing else. The art, the records, the trophies, those stay." My mother's face crumbled. "Celeste's trust fund remains, as grandfather intended. But you too, you receive nothing." He blinked. "You'll ruin us. You ruined yourselves." They didn't speak again. 2 weeks later, I stood in the front hall of Whitmore Estate. My estate. Movers carried boxes past me as my parents gave clipped instructions. No one spoke to me directly. Celeste arrived last, in a quiet car with no driver. She walked over, holding a small velvet box. "These belong to him," she said. I took them. I'm sorry." Inside were grandfather's cufflinks, the ones he wore every Sunday. "I bought them back," she added, "from the pawn shop." I nodded. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't about winning. After they left, I walked through the house, alone, room by room, restoring it piece by piece. I placed grandfather's watch back on his old desk, under the sailing chart we once studied together. "We did it," I whispered, "just like you planned." In the weeks that followed, I sold the estate, not out of anger, but because it was too full of ghosts. I used part of the proceeds to start the Franklin Whitmore Foundation, an ethics in business nonprofit. I restructured Whitmore and Hart to prioritize sustainability and community partnerships. I moved into a modest home in Boston, and I finally began to heal. A year later, I visited his grave. I placed a folded sailing map beside the flowers, our private signal for mission accomplished. I kept my promise, I told him. I sailed against the wind. And I didn't break.